The morning mist clung to the headstones like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release its hold on Willowbrook Cemetery. Thaddeus Crane adjusted his worn leather gloves and shouldered his spade, beginning another day of tending to the eternal residents of his domain. For 23 years, he had walked these paths, mowed these lawns, and planted these flowers. The cemetery wasn't just his workplace, it was his sanctuary. At 62, Thaddeus possessed the weathered hands of a man who understood soil the way sailors understand wind. Every blade of grass told him a story. Every subtle change in the earth's color whispered secrets about what lay beneath. His father had been a farmer, and his grandfather before him. The earth spoke to the Crane family in ways that city folk never understood. This particular October morning, something felt different. Thaddeus paused near the Morrison family plot, a well-maintained section with marble headstones dating back to the 1920s. The grass here had always grown thick and even, fed by the rich soil and careful attention he'd given it over the years. But today, a patch of ground between the Morrison graves and the neighboring Whitfield plot looked wrong. He knelt down, running his fingers through the grass. The blades felt different, slightly coarser, and the soil beneath showed a subtle discoloration. Where the rest of the area displayed the deep brown of well-composted earth, this patch held traces of gray clay that didn't belong in this section of the cemetery. Odd, he murmured, making a mental note to investigate further. Thaddeus continued his rounds, but his eyes kept drifting back to inconsistencies he'd never noticed before. Near the children's section, another patch of grass grew differently, sparse and pale compared to the surrounding area. By the old oak tree that marked the cemetery's eastern boundary, the ground showed signs of settling that seemed too recent for graves that were supposedly decades old. How had he missed these signs? As the morning progressed, Thaddeus found himself creating a mental map of anomalies. 7 distinct areas showed irregularities in soil composition, grass growth, or ground level. 7 areas that didn't match any burial records he could recall. The autumn sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the cemetery in sharp detail. Families began arriving for their weekly visits, carrying fresh flowers and quiet prayers. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, a regular visitor for the past 5 years, approached with a bouquet of chrysanthemums. "Good morning, Thaddeus," she called, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd grown to consider the groundskeeper a friend. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Morning, Mrs. Hartwell." Thaddeus tipped his cap. "Indeed it is. Visiting Harold today. Every Saturday, as you know." She smiled sadly. 47 years of marriage doesn't end just because he's resting here. Thaddeus watched her walk toward her husband's grave, her steps careful on the slightly uneven ground. He'd always admired the dedication of visitors like Mrs. Hartwell, people who understood that love transcended death. Their faithfulness made his job feel sacred rather than simply practical. But today, watching her navigate the cemetery paths, he noticed something that made his chest tighten. She automatically stepped around certain areas, unconsciously avoiding spots where the ground felt unstable beneath her feet. Had she been doing this for years? Had her body somehow sensed what his trained eye had missed? The thought disturbed him more than he cared to admit. At lunch, Thaddeus sat on his usual bench overlooking the newer section of the cemetery. He pulled out his worn notebook, a habit he'd developed years ago to track maintenance needs and seasonal changes. Today, instead of noting which areas needed reseeding or which headstones required cleaning, he sketched a rough map of the cemetery and marked the 7 anomalous locations. The pattern that emerged made his sandwich taste like dust. The irregular patches formed a rough circle around the cemetery's perimeter, each positioned in areas that were rarely visited by families. Whoever had placed them there, if indeed they had been placed, understood the cemetery's traffic patterns. They knew which sections drew regular visitors and which remained largely forgotten. Thaddeus closed his notebook and returned to work, but concentration proved impossible. Every step took him past another question mark, another subtle sign that the ground beneath his feet held secrets he'd never imagined. As afternoon shadows lengthened, he found himself standing in the Morrison plot again, staring at the patch of discolored soil. The sensible part of his mind offered rational explanations: old utility lines, shifted drainage, natural variations in soil composition. But his instincts, honed by decades of working the earth, screamed that something was wrong. He glanced around, ensuring no visitors were nearby, then knelt and began digging with his hands. The soil felt different from the surrounding area, looser, as if it had been disturbed and replaced. About 8 inches down, his fingers encountered something that made him freeze. A fragment of fabric. Blue denim, faded and rotted, but unmistakably clothing. Thaddeus pulled his hand back as if he'd touched fire. His heart hammered against his ribs as he stared at the small hole he'd created. The fabric could be anything: a discarded rag, debris from old maintenance work, even part of a burial shroud from a legitimate grave. But he knew better. Standing on unsteady legs, he brushed dirt from his hands and looked around the cemetery with new eyes. The 7 anomalous patches no longer seemed like minor inconsistencies. They looked like markers, coordinates on a map of hidden graves. The sun was setting, casting long shadows between the headstones. Families had departed, leaving the cemetery to its eternal residents and one very troubled groundskeeper. Thaddeus walked slowly toward his maintenance shed, his mind racing with possibilities he didn't want to consider. Inside the shed, surrounded by tools and supplies that had become as familiar as his own hands, he sat heavily on a wooden crate and pulled out his notebook again. He stared at the map he'd drawn, at the 7 marked locations, at the circle they formed around the cemetery's edge. Someone had been burying bodies in unmarked graves. Someone who knew the cemetery well enough to choose locations that would remain undisturbed. Someone who had access to tools and the freedom to work without being questioned. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Whoever had done this had worked at the cemetery, had walked these same paths, tended these same graves, earned the trust of grieving families just as he had. Thaddeus reached for his phone, then hesitated. What would he tell the police? That he'd found a piece of fabric in the ground? That the grass grew differently in certain areas? They'd think he was a crazy old man seeing ghosts and shadows. But he couldn't ignore what he'd discovered. If his suspicions were correct, families had been visiting this cemetery for years, placing flowers and saying prayers mere feet from unmarked graves. The thought made him sick. He needed proof. As darkness settled over Willowbrook Cemetery, Thaddeus made a decision that would change everything. He would investigate each of the 7 locations, carefully and methodically. If he found evidence of unmarked burials, he would take it to the authorities. If he found nothing, he could return to his peaceful routine with a clear conscience. But deep in his heart, he already knew what he would find. The soil never lied. Detective Marlowe Blackwood had seen enough crime scenes to know when something was wrong, and the call from Willowbrook Cemetery had all the hallmarks of a case that would keep him awake at night. At 45, he'd earned a reputation for methodical investigation and stubborn persistence, qualities that had solved more cold cases than his colleagues cared to count. The morning after Thaddeus's discovery, Marlowe stood in the cemetery's main office, studying the groundskeeper who'd made the call. The older man's hands shook slightly as he poured coffee, and his usual calm demeanor had been replaced by barely contained anxiety. "Tell me again what you found," Marlowe said, settling into the chair across from Thaddeus's desk. "3 more pieces of fabric," Thaddeus replied, his voice steady despite his obvious distress. "Different colors, different types of material. All buried in areas where the soil composition doesn't match the surrounding ground." Marlowe nodded, making notes. "And you're certain these aren't related to legitimate burials?" "Detective, I've worked this cemetery for 23 years. I know every grave, every burial, every bit of maintenance work that's been done here. These patches. He pulled out his notebook and showed Marlowe the map. They're not on any official records. 7 locations total, 7 confirmed. But I suspect there might be more. Marlowe studied the map, noting the pattern Thaddeus had identified. You think someone was using the cemetery as a dumping ground? Someone who worked here, Thaddeus said quietly. Someone who knew the cemetery well enough to choose locations that wouldn't be disturbed. Someone who had access to tools and the authority to dig without raising suspicions. The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Marlowe had worked cases where trusted community members had betrayed that trust in horrific ways. The pattern was always the same. Predators who used their positions to hide their crimes in plain sight. I'll need to bring in a forensic team, Marlowe said. This is going to attract attention. Are you prepared for that? Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the cemetery grounds. This place has been my life's work, detective. These people trusted me to care for their loved ones. If someone violated that trust, if someone turned this sacred ground into a hunting ground. He met Marlowe's eyes. I need to know the truth. 2 hours later, the quiet sanctity of Willowbrook Cemetery was shattered by the arrival of the forensic team. Dr. Vivian Sterling, the county's chief forensic archaeologist, directed the initial survey with the precision of someone who understood that disturbing the dead required both scientific rigor and reverent care. We'll start with ground-penetrating radar, she explained to Marlowe and Thaddeus. It'll give us a better picture of what's below the surface before we start digging. The radar equipment looked alien among the traditional headstones and manicured lawns. Curious passers-by gathered at the cemetery gates, whispering among themselves as news of the investigation spread through the small town of Millbrook. Thaddeus watched the proceedings with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Part of him hoped the radar would reveal nothing more than root systems and old utility lines. But when Dr. Sterling's expression grew increasingly grave as she studied the readings, he knew his worst fears were being confirmed. Detective, she called, her voice tight with professional concern. You need to see this. The first radar sweep of the Morrison plot area revealed a distinct outline approximately 6 feet below the surface, the unmistakable shape of a human body. But what made Dr. Sterling's face pale was the discovery of a second shape, and then a third, buried at different depths in the same general area. Multiple bodies, she confirmed. Stacked burial, which is definitely not standard cemetery practice. Marlowe felt his stomach clench. How many? In this location alone? At least 3, possibly more. And detective. She pointed to the radar screen. None of these show signs of traditional burial preparation. No coffins, no burial shrouds. They were just placed in the ground. The excavation of the first site began that afternoon. Dr. Sterling supervised the careful removal of soil, treating each layer as potential evidence. Thaddeus stood at the perimeter, watching strangers disturb ground he'd tended for decades. As the afternoon wore on, the excavation revealed its secrets with grim efficiency. The first body was found wrapped in a tarp, the remains of a middle-aged woman whose personal effects suggested she'd been buried sometime in the 1990s. A driver's license found in her pocket identified her as Rebecca Martinez, reported missing from a neighboring town in 1994. 29 years, Dr. Sterling observed quietly. She's been here 29 years. The second body was found 4 feet deeper, an older man whose wallet identified him as Frank Morrison, missing since 1989. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone present. He'd been buried in the plot that now bore his family name, hidden beneath the graves of people who'd never known he was there. By evening, 3 bodies had been recovered from the single location. Each victim had been reported missing over a span of 15 years, from 1985 to 2000. Each had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind devastated families and cold case files that had grown dusty with time. Marlowe stood in the cemetery as the sun set, watching the forensic team secure the scene. The investigation had only just begun, but already the scope of the crimes was staggering. If the other 6 locations yielded similar results, they were looking at one of the most prolific serial killers in the state's history. Detective Thaddeus approached, looking older than his 62 years. "I've been thinking about who might have done this. Tell me." The groundskeeper position before mine was held by a man named Garrett Ashford. He worked here for nearly 30 years, from 1975 to 2005. Retired just a few years before I started. Thaddeus paused, his expression troubled. I always wondered why he left so suddenly. One day he was here, the next he was gone. No retirement party, no farewell. Just gone. Marlowe made a note of the name. Any idea where he went? I heard he moved to Florida, but I was never sure. The cemetery board didn't talk about him much, which I always thought was strange. 30 years of service, and they acted like he'd never existed. I'll need his employment records, personnel files, anything the cemetery has on him. Already pulled them, Thaddeus said, handing over a manila folder. Garrett Ashford, age 68 when he retired. No disciplinary actions, no complaints. Model employee, at least on paper. Marlowe opened the folder and studied the photograph clipped to the employment application. Garrett Ashford looked like any other middle-aged man, unremarkable features, friendly smile, the kind of person who could blend into any crowd. But his eyes held something that made Marlowe's skin crawl. A coldness that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. The timeline fits, Marlowe observed. If he was killing people from 1985 to 2000, he would have had complete access to the cemetery. He could have chosen burial sites, dug graves, and covered his tracks without anyone questioning his activities. He knew this place better than anyone, Thaddeus agreed. Every tree, every drainage pattern, every area that families visited regularly. He could have been burying bodies for years without anyone noticing. As night fell over Willowbrook Cemetery, Marlowe felt the weight of the investigation settling on his shoulders. Tomorrow, they would excavate the remaining sites. They would contact families of missing persons, matching names to remains. They would begin the long process of bringing justice to victims who had been forgotten by everyone except the man who'd killed them. But tonight, standing among the headstones with a groundskeeper who devoted his life to honoring the dead, Marlowe couldn't shake the feeling that they were only beginning to understand the scope of Garrett Ashford's crimes. The soil had kept its secrets for decades. Now, finally, it was ready to tell its story. The next morning brought news crews, curious onlookers, and a sense of dread that settled over Millbrook like a funeral shroud. Word of the discoveries at Willowbrook Cemetery had spread beyond the town's borders, attracting attention from regional media and state law enforcement officials. Detective Marlowe Blackwood arrived at the cemetery to find the entrance blocked by reporters and television bans. The peaceful sanctuary that had served the community for over a century had become the center of a media circus. Detective Blackwood, a young reporter, thrust a microphone toward him. "Can you confirm reports of multiple bodies found in unmarked graves?" Marlowe pushed through the crowd without comment, but the questions followed him like persistent shadows. How many victims? How long had they been there? Was there a serial killer operating in their quiet town? Inside the cemetery gates, the scene was more controlled but no less intense. Dr. Sterling's team had expanded overnight, bringing in additional archaeologists, forensic specialists, and support staff. The excavation had grown from a single site to a coordinated investigation covering multiple locations. "We've completed the radar survey of all 7 sites," Dr. Sterling reported as Marlowe approached. "The news isn't good." She led him to a table where she laid out preliminary findings. The radar images showed clear evidence of human remains at 6 of the 7 locations. Conservative estimates suggested a minimum of 23 bodies, possibly more. 23, Marlowe repeated, the number hitting him like a physical blow. Christ. The burial patterns are consistent, Dr. Sterling continued. Multiple bodies per location, stacked at different depths, no traditional burial preparations. Whoever did this was systematic, methodical. They knew exactly what they were doing. Thaddeus joined them, his face drawn with exhaustion and grief. I've been going through old employment records, he said. Garrett Ashford wasn't just the groundskeeper. He was also involved in funeral preparations, grave digging, and cemetery maintenance. He would have known the optimal locations for secret burials. Any luck tracking down his current location? Marlowe asked. That's the problem, Thaddeus replied. There's no record of him after 2005. No forwarding address, no pension payments, no death certificate. It's like he vanished. The investigation team had divided into specialized groups. One focused on the excavation and identification of remains. Another worked on matching the victims to missing persons cases. A third group, led by Marlowe, concentrated on tracking down Garrett Ashford and building a case against him. As the day progressed, the stories of the victims began to emerge. Agatha Louise, a college student who disappeared in 1987 while visiting friends in a nearby town. Marcus Thompson, a traveling salesman whose car had been found abandoned on a rural highway in 1992. Elena Vasquez, a mother of 3 who'd vanished after her evening shift at a local diner in 1996. Each victim had been someone's child, parent, or sibling. Each disappearance had launched desperate searches, generated missing persons reports, and left families in agonizing uncertainty. Now, decades later, they were finally coming home. Detective, Dr. Sterling called from the excavation site. We've found something significant. Marlowe hurried over to find her kneeling beside a partially exposed skeleton. Unlike the other victims, this one showed signs of having been buried with personal effects, jewelry, clothing, and something that made Dr. Sterling's expression particularly grim. A cemetery employee badge, she said, holding up a tarnished metal pin. Belongs to someone named James Cordelia. According to the records, he worked here from 1998 to 2000. The implications were staggering. Ashford killed one of his own employees? It looks that way. And there's more. Dr. Sterling pointed to trauma marks on the skull. This victim shows signs of blunt force trauma. He was murdered. Thaddeus studied the badge with growing horror. I remember James. He was young, maybe 25, just starting his career in cemetery management. He left suddenly in 2000, said he'd gotten a better opportunity in another state. Except he never left, Marlowe observed. Ashford killed him and buried him here, then told everyone he'd moved away. The discovery of James Cordelia's remains changed the entire dynamic of the investigation. This wasn't just a serial killer who'd used the cemetery as a dumping ground. It was someone who'd eliminated potential witnesses to his crimes. Someone who'd maintained his cover by silencing anyone who might have discovered his secret. As evening approached, the excavation teams had recovered remains from 4 of the 7 sites. The victim count had risen to 16, with more expected as the investigation continued. Each discovery brought new questions about motive, method, and the scope of Ashford's crimes. Marlowe stood in the cemetery office, staring at a timeline he'd constructed on the whiteboard. The pattern was clear. Ashford had been killing people for at least 15 years, possibly longer. He'd targeted transients, travelers, and people whose disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger intensive investigations. He was smart, Marlowe said aloud, studying the timeline. He chose victims who could vanish without raising too many questions. People who were already on the margins of society. Except for James Cordelia, Thaddeus pointed out. That was different. That was about covering his tracks. Which means he was getting sloppy. Or desperate. Something made him feel threatened enough to kill someone who worked with him. The phone rang, interrupting their discussion. Marlowe answered to find Captain Rodriguez on the line, his voice tense with urgency. "We've got a development," Rodriguez said. "Florida State Police found Garrett Ashford. He's been living in a retirement community outside Tampa for the past 18 years. Is he under arrest? That's the problem. He's been dead for 6 months. Natural causes, according to the death certificate. Heart attack." Marlowe felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that Ashford could never kill again. Frustration that they'd never get answers to the questions that haunted him. 6 months. February 15, 2024. He was 78 years old. After hanging up, Marlowe shared the news with Thaddeus and Dr. Sterling. The groundskeeper's reaction was complex. Grief for the victims who'd never see justice, anger at the man who'd violated his sacred trust, and a strange sense of closure knowing that the killer could never hurt anyone again. "At least it's over," Thaddeus said quietly. "For him, maybe," Marlowe replied. "But we still have work to do. 23 families are going to get answers they've waited decades to hear. That's worth something." As night fell over Willowbrook Cemetery for the 3rd time since the investigation began, the excavation sites were covered and secured. Tomorrow would bring more discoveries, more identifications, and more painful phone calls to families who'd never stopped hoping for news of their missing loved ones. But tonight, in the quiet darkness between the headstones, there was a sense that the cemetery was finally ready to release its secrets. The soil had kept faith with the dead, holding their stories safe until someone cared enough to listen. Thaddeus walked the familiar paths one more time before leaving, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The cemetery looked different now, forever changed by the knowledge of what lay beneath its peaceful surface. But it was still sacred ground, still a place where love transcended death and memory honored the departed. Even the unmarked graves deserved that much. The 4th day of the investigation brought a development that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. Dr. Sterling's team had expanded their search beyond the original 7 sites, using ground-penetrating radar to survey the entire cemetery. What they found defied everyone's worst expectations. 37, Dr. Sterling announced during the morning briefing, her voice hollow with exhaustion. 37 potential burial sites scattered throughout the cemetery. Some are single graves, others contain multiple bodies. Detective Marlowe Blackwood stared at the expanded map, trying to comprehend the scope of what they'd uncovered. Red dots marked confirmed burial sites, yellow dots indicated probable locations, and green dots showed areas that required further investigation. The cemetery looked like a battlefield marked with casualty reports. "Conservative estimate?" he asked. "Minimum 45 victims, possibly as many as 60, Dr. Sterling replied. Garrett Ashford wasn't just a serial killer. He was operating what amounts to a private cemetery within the legitimate one. Thaddeus sat in stunned silence, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. For 23 years, he'd walked over these graves, mowed grass that grew from soil enriched by the remains of murder victims. The weight of unknowing complicity pressed down on him like a physical burden. "How did no one notice?" he whispered. "How did I not notice?" "Because he was clever," Marlowe said. "He chose locations carefully, spaced the burials out over time, and made sure the graves looked natural. You couldn't have known." But Thaddeus wasn't consoled. His life's work had been built on respect for the dead and care for the living. Discovering that he'd been an unwitting guardian of a serial killer's graveyard shattered something fundamental in his worldview. The investigation team had grown to include specialists from 3 counties, FBI behavioral analysts, and a victim identification unit that worked around the clock to match remains with missing persons cases. The quiet cemetery had become a hub of activity that never slept. As the days passed, The victims' stories began to emerge in tragic detail. Margaret Walsh, a grandmother who disappeared while visiting her daughter in 1988. Robert Kim, a college professor whose car had been found abandoned after a conference in 1991. Lisa Brennan, a nurse who'd vanished during her drive home from a late shift in 1995. Each identification brought closure to families who'd lived with uncertainty for decades. But it also revealed the calculated nature of Ashford's crimes. He hadn't killed randomly. He'd selected victims who were traveling through the area, people whose disappearances wouldn't immediately focus attention on Millbrook. He was methodical. FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Patricia Meridian explained during a briefing. These weren't crimes of passion or opportunity. He was hunting, selecting victims who fit specific criteria. What criteria? Marlowe asked. Travelers, people passing through town, individuals who wouldn't be missed immediately. He avoided locals, anyone whose disappearance would trigger intensive searches in the area. He was protecting his hunting ground. The psychological profile that emerged painted a picture of a highly intelligent, organized killer who'd used his position of trust to lure victims to their deaths. Ashford had been the perfect predator, unremarkable, helpful, and completely above suspicion. But the investigation also revealed something else. Ashford hadn't worked alone. The discovery came during the excavation of a site near the cemetery's eastern wall. Dr. Sterling's team uncovered remains that had been buried with unusual care, wrapped in plastic, placed in a wooden box, and covered with lime to accelerate decomposition. The level of preparation suggested knowledge of forensic techniques that went beyond what a groundskeeper would typically possess. Someone with medical or forensic training helped him, Dr. Sterling observed. The burial preparation shows understanding of how to destroy evidence and accelerate decomposition. A partner? Marlowe asked. Or someone he was blackmailing. The care taken with this burial suggests it was someone important to him, either an accomplice or a victim who posed a particular threat. The victim was identified as Dr. Harrison Blackthorne, a forensic pathologist who'd worked at the county medical examiner's office from 1990 to 1999. His disappearance had been explained as an early retirement to pursue private practice, but no one had ever confirmed his new location. He must have discovered something, Thaddeus said. Maybe he noticed patterns in missing persons cases, or questioned why certain bodies were never found. So Ashford killed him and covered it up, Marlowe concluded. Made it look like he'd moved away, just like he did with James Cordelia. The investigation into Dr. Blackthorne's disappearance revealed a troubling pattern. Several missing persons cases from the 1990s had been closed prematurely, with insufficient investigation into potential homicides. Someone had been steering investigations away from Millbrook, preventing authorities from discovering the connection between the disappearances and the cemetery. Ashford had help, Dr. Meridian confirmed. Someone in law enforcement or the medical examiner's office was protecting him, either willingly or through coercion. The possibility that corruption had enabled Ashford's crimes for decades sent shockwaves through the investigation. How many victims could have been saved if someone had connected the dots earlier? How many families had suffered needlessly because the truth had been buried along with the bodies? As the excavation continued, each new discovery brought fresh horrors. A section near the children's graves contained the remains of 3 teenagers who disappeared from a nearby town in 1993. A site by the old chapel revealed the bodies of an elderly couple who'd been reported missing during a cross-country trip in 1987. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was made in the oldest section of the cemetery, where 19th-century headstones marked the graves of Millbrook's founding families. Hidden among the legitimate graves were the remains of Ashford's earliest victims, people who'd been killed in the 1970s and early 1980s, before he'd refined his methods. He's been doing this for over 30 years, Dr. Sterling announced grimly. Some of these remains show signs of experimentation, different burial techniques, various methods of concealment. He was learning, perfecting his craft. The victim count continued to climb. By the end of the week, they'd confirmed 53 bodies, with several more sites still under investigation. The quiet cemetery had become the final resting place for one of the largest serial killing sprees in American history. Media attention reached a fever pitch as news outlets from across the country descended on Millbrook. The small town struggled to cope with the sudden infamy, its residents grappling with the knowledge that they'd lived for decades in the shadow of a mass murderer. But for Thaddeus, the media attention was secondary to a more personal struggle. Each newly identified victim felt like a personal failure, someone he should have protected, someone whose presence in the cemetery he should have sensed. "I should have known," he told Marlowe one evening as they stood among the excavation sites. "This place was my responsibility. I should have felt their presence." "You did know," Marlowe replied. "Your instincts led us to the truth. Without you, these victims might have remained hidden forever." It was small comfort, but it was something. The investigation had revealed the full scope of Ashford's crimes, but it had also shown that even the most carefully buried secrets eventually find their way to the surface. The soil might keep its secrets for decades, but it never forgets. As the investigation entered its second week, the focus shifted from discovery to justice. Families of victims deserved answers, and the community needed to heal from the revelation that their peaceful cemetery had been a hunting ground for one of history's most prolific serial killers. The dead had finally found their voices. Now it was time to make sure their stories were heard. 2 weeks after the first discovery, Willowbrook Cemetery had been transformed into something unrecognizable. Yellow tape sectioned off excavation sites, temporary lighting illuminated areas that had once known only moonlight and dawn, and the constant hum of generators had replaced the natural silence of the dead. Detective Marlowe Blackwood stood at the cemetery's main gate, watching the controlled chaos of the investigation. The final count had reached 62 confirmed victims, spanning from 1975 to 2000. Garrett Ashford had been active for 25 years, killing an average of 2 to 3 people annually with clockwork precision. "Detective," Dr. Sterling approached, carrying a folder thick with documentation. "We've finished the preliminary analysis of the burial patterns. You need to see this." She led him to a table where she'd laid out aerial photographs of the cemetery taken at different time periods. The images, spanning from 1970 to 2005, showed the gradual transformation of the grounds under Ashford's tenure. "Look at the progression," she said, pointing to changes in landscaping and ground contours. He was literally reshaping the cemetery to accommodate his victims. New flower beds, adjusted walking paths, strategic placement of benches and memorial gardens, all designed to disguise burial sites. Marlowe studied the photographs, marveling at the calculated nature of the deception. He turned the entire cemetery into his personal killing field. And he was getting bolder over time. The later burials show less care and concealment, larger groupings of bodies, more risks taken. Something was driving him to escalate. The answer to that escalation came from an unexpected source. While reviewing personnel files from the cemetery's administrative office, Thaddeus had discovered a series of letters dating from 1998 to 2000. The correspondence revealed that the cemetery board had been considering modernization projects that would have included comprehensive ground surveys and drainage improvements. He knew they were going to discover the graves, Thaddeus explained to Marlowe. The board was planning to install new irrigation systems, which would have required digging throughout the cemetery. He was running out of time. So he accelerated his timeline, Marlowe concluded. Started killing more frequently, taking greater risks, trying to satisfy whatever drove him before the truth came out. That's when he killed James Cordelia and Dr. Blackthorne, Dr. Sterling added. They were threats to his operation, people who might have discovered his secret during the modernization process. The investigation had also revealed the extent of Ashford's preparation and planning. His modest apartment in Florida had been searched after his death, revealing journals that detailed his crimes with chilling precision. The entries read like a hunter's log, documenting victim selection, burial techniques, and methods of concealment. But perhaps most disturbing were the photographs. Ashford had documented his victims, both before and after their deaths. The images showed people in their final moments, terrified, pleading, unaware that they were being preserved in a killer's twisted gallery. He kept trophies, Dr. Meridian explained during a briefing. Not just photographs, but personal items from each victim. Jewelry, identification cards, small mementos that he could use to relive the kills. The trophies had been recovered from a storage unit Ashford had rented in Florida, paid for decades in advance. The collection included items from all 62 confirmed victims, providing conclusive evidence of his crimes and helping to identify several bodies that had been too decomposed for other methods. As the investigation moved toward its conclusion, the focus shifted to the community's healing process. Families of victims had begun arriving in Millbrook, seeking closure and answers that had eluded them for decades. The cemetery had become a pilgrimage site for grief that had been frozen in time. Martha Kellerman, whose daughter Sarah had disappeared in 1987, stood at the excavation site where her child's remains had been found. She was 73 now, her hair white and her back bent with age, but her eyes held the same fierce love that had driven her to search for Sarah for 36 years. "I always knew she was still out there," Martha told Thaddeus, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "A mother knows. I could feel her calling to me." Thaddeus nodded, understanding her pain in a way that surprised him. "She's at peace now," he said quietly. "She can rest." The cemetery had become a place of pilgrimage for dozens of families, each seeking their own form of closure. Some came with anger, demanding to know how such horrors could have been hidden for so long. Others came with gratitude, finally having answers to questions that had haunted them for decades. For Thaddeus, each family's visit was a reminder of the sacred trust that had been violated. He'd taken to working longer hours, personally overseeing the restoration of areas that had been disturbed by the investigation. It was his way of making amends, of honoring both the legitimate dead and the victims who'd been hidden among them. "You don't have to carry this burden alone," Marlowe told him one evening as they walked through the cemetery together. "None of this was your fault." "I know that intellectually," Thaddeus replied. "But knowing and feeling are different things. This place was my responsibility. These people trusted me to care for their loved ones, and I was walking over murder victims every day. You were also the one who discovered the truth. Without your instincts, your knowledge of the ground, these families would never have gotten closure." As autumn deepened into winter, the investigation officially concluded. The cemetery board had voted to create a memorial garden for Ashford's victims, a place where their names would be remembered and their stories honored. Thaddeus had volunteered to design and maintain the memorial, seeing it as part of his ongoing responsibility to the dead. The garden would occupy a section of the cemetery that had been in use during Ashford's tenure, ground that held no hidden graves, no buried secrets. Native wildflowers would bloom there in spring, and a simple stone monument would bear the names of all 62 victims. Dr. Sterling's final report documented not just the scope of Ashford's crimes, but the methods he'd used to avoid detection. His careful victim selection, strategic burial locations, and manipulation of cemetery records had created a nearly perfect crime. Only the passage of time and a groundskeeper's intuitive understanding of the earth had finally brought the truth to light. "He was one of the most organized killers we've ever studied," Dr. Meridian concluded in her psychological profile. "His ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while systematically murdering people for 25 years demonstrates a level of planning and self-control that's genuinely rare." But the investigation had also revealed something else: the power of the human spirit to seek truth and justice, even when that truth was buried beneath decades of deception. Thaddeus's refusal to ignore his instincts had given 62 families the closure they'd sought for years. Spring came to Willowbrook Cemetery with unusual beauty, as if the earth itself was celebrating the liberation of its buried secrets. The excavation sites had been filled and reseeded, the investigation equipment removed, and the normal rhythms of cemetery life gradually restored. Thaddeus stood in the new memorial garden, watching the first wildflowers push through the rich soil. The stone monument had been installed the previous week, its polished surface bearing the names of all 62 victims in elegant script. Below their names was a simple inscription, "Gone but not forgotten. May they finally rest in peace." The garden had become a destination for families, visitors, and people from around the country who'd been touched by the story of Willowbrook Cemetery. Unlike the hidden graves that had gone unvisited for decades, the memorial garden was never without flowers, never without someone paying their respects. Detective Marlowe Blackwood visited regularly, partly for professional reasons and partly because he'd grown to respect the groundskeeper who'd uncovered one of the largest serial killing cases in American history. Today's visit was different. He came with news that would finally close the book on Garrett Ashford's crimes. "We found his first victim," Marlowe announced, joining Thaddeus beside the memorial stone. "A transient named William Graves. Disappeared in 1974. DNA evidence confirms it's him." "Where?" "Buried under what used to be the maintenance shed. Ashford built the shed directly over the grave in 1976, probably to make sure the body would never be discovered accidentally." Thaddeus absorbed this information with the weary acceptance of someone who'd learned to expect the worst from human nature. 63 victims, he said quietly, spanning 26 years. "The longest active serial killing career in recorded history," Marlowe confirmed. "And if you hadn't noticed those soil inconsistencies, he might have taken that record to his grave." They stood in comfortable silence, two men who'd been forever changed by their journey into the darkness of human evil. Around them, the cemetery continued its eternal mission of honoring the dead and comforting the living, but it would never again be the simple sanctuary it had once been. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell approached, carrying her weekly bouquet for her husband's grave. She'd become a regular visitor to the memorial garden as well, drawn by a sense of connection to the families who'd waited so long for answers. "Good morning, Thaddeus," she called. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Indeed it is, Mrs. Hartwell. Harold would have loved this weather." She paused at the memorial stone, reading the names as she did every week. "I keep thinking about their families," she said. "How they must have suffered, not knowing what happened. At least when Harold died, I knew where he was. I could visit him, talk to him, feel close to him. These families had nothing. They have closure now," Thaddeus replied. "That's worth something." "It's worth everything," she agreed. As Mrs. Hartwell continued to her husband's grave, Marlowe studied Thaddeus's weathered face. The groundskeeper had aged years in the months since the investigation began, but there was something else in his expression, a quiet peace that hadn't been there before. "You've found your purpose in all this," Marlowe observed. "I suppose I have. This place is still sacred ground, but it's also a testament to the power of truth. No matter how deeply secrets are buried, eventually they find their way to the surface." The memorial garden had attracted attention from landscape architects and memorial designers around the world. Thaddeus had received offers to design similar gardens for other sites, to share his expertise in creating spaces that honored victims of violence. But he'd declined them all. "My place is here," he'd told the architects. "These people, both the legitimate dead and Ashford's victims, they're my responsibility. I won't abandon them again." The cemetery board had offered him a promotion, a chance to oversee multiple facilities and expand his influence. He'd declined that as well. His calling was simpler and more profound, to tend this ground, to honor these dead, and to ensure that the truth was never again buried beneath careful landscaping and willful ignorance. As summer approached, the memorial garden reached full bloom. Native wildflowers painted the space in brilliant colors, creating a living tribute to lives cut short by a killer's twisted compulsions. The sight drew visitors from around the world, people who came to pay their respects and to witness the place where justice had finally prevailed. But for Thaddeus, the garden's greatest success was quieter and more personal. It was in the faces of family members who finally had a place to grieve, in the peace that had settled over the cemetery's other graves, and in his own renewed faith that his work mattered. One evening, as the sun set behind the old oak tree that marked the cemetery's eastern boundary, Thaddeus made his final rounds of the day. He checked the memorial garden, ensuring that the flowers were properly watered and that the stone monument was clean. He walked the familiar paths between legitimate graves, noting which sections needed attention and which families had visited. Finally, he paused at the place where his investigation had begun, the Morrison family plot where he'd first noticed the soil inconsistencies that had led to Ashford's exposure. The grass grew thick and healthy there now, nourished by earth that no longer held its dark secrets. The soil had kept faith with the dead, holding their stories safe until someone cared enough to listen. Now, finally, both the legitimate dead and the hidden victims could rest in peace. Thaddeus Crane, groundskeeper of Willowbrook Cemetery, walked home through the gathering darkness, knowing that his sacred trust had been restored. The dead were at peace, the living had their answers, and the truth had finally set them all free. Behind him, the memorial garden glowed softly in the moonlight, 63 names carved in stone serving as an eternal reminder that every life has value, every death deserves justice, and every secret buried in the earth will eventually find its way to the light. The soil never lies. It only waits for someone wise enough to read its secrets and brave enough to disturb the peace in service of a greater justice. In the end, that was Thaddeus Crane's greatest achievement, not the perfect maintenance of peaceful grounds, but the courage to listen when the earth itself cried out for justice. The groundskeeper's secret had become the cemetery's salvation, transforming a place of hidden horrors into a monument to the power of truth. And in the memorial garden, where wildflowers bloomed eternal above ground that held no secrets, the dead finally rested in the peace they had always deserved. The end. We encourage you to like and subscribe to our channel if you enjoyed the video. Please share your thoughts in the comments section and explore our channel for a diverse range of content, including audiobooks, murder mysteries, psychological thrillers, and classic novels. We strive to provide comprehensive and engaging storytelling experiences. Your visit is highly appreciated, and we are confident you will find content to your liking.